Daniel Harlow was the kind of man who let silence do his speaking. People in Willow Creek said he had the patience of the mountains, solid, unshaken, and always watching from a distance. He had inherited his ranch after his father's sudden passing, but unlike other ranchers who bragged at saloons or fought over cattle prices at the market, Daniel stayed on his land, working from dawn until the stars lit the black sky. The neighbors often saw his lantern glowing in the barn long past midnight. He was a man of few words, a man who preferred the company of horses to people, and a man who had learned that talking too much often got others killed. The ranch stretched wide, a piece of land cut by fences and lined with cottonwoods that whispered whenever the prairie winds passed through. On most days, the only sounds were the creak of saddle leather, the lowing of cattle, and the slow crunch of Daniel's boots across the dirt. Peaceful to outsiders, but Daniel knew how quickly peace could be broken. He carried his past like a quiet shadow, something he never spoke of but which hardened his eyes whenever trouble was mentioned. That September evening, the sky was painted gold, the kind of sunset that made the barns glow as if they were set aflame. Daniel stood in the corral, brushing down his chestnut mare. The animal pressed its head against his shoulder, trusting him as all the horses did. It was then he noticed Clara, the maid who had been working for him only a few months, crossing the yard from the kitchen house toward the pump. She walked slower than usual, her left leg dragging slightly as though each step pressed against something painful. Daniel narrowed his eyes. She was young, barely in her 20s, quiet much like himself, and grateful for the work he'd given her after she'd arrived in town alone. At first, he thought she was simply tired, perhaps overworked from scrubbing and hauling water all day, but as she stepped into the fading light, he saw her hand gripping the side of her skirt tightly, almost as though hiding something beneath the fabric. Her shoulders were tense, her breathing uneven, and when she reached the pump handle, she nearly stumbled. Daniel set down the brush, his jaw tightening. He wasn't a man who pried into others' affairs. Folks in town knew that if you wanted gossip, you didn't go to Daniel Harlow. He had no time for it, but this was different. There was something in Clara's eyes as she glanced toward him, something she tried to cover with a polite nod. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was fear. Daniel walked slowly across the yard, his boots crunching the dirt. Clara froze when she noticed his approach, her grip on the pump tightening. "Evenin', Mr. Harlow," she said softly, forcing a small smile. "Evenin'," he replied, his voice calm, steady. His words were always measured, like he weighed each before releasing it. "You're limping," her smile faltered. "Oh, just slipped on the kitchen steps earlier. Nothing to fret about." Daniel's gaze lingered on her face. Her skin was pale beneath the smudge of flour dusting her cheek, and her lips trembled slightly. He'd seen that look before, back when he rode with men who carried secrets in their wounds. It wasn't the look of someone who'd slipped on steps. It was the look of someone who was hiding something heavy. "You sure?" he asked, his tone even but carrying an undertone that pressed for honesty. "Yes, sir," she said quickly, eyes darting toward the barn as though wishing to escape the conversation. She lifted the bucket of water, wincing as the weight shifted her body. "I'll be fine." Daniel didn't press further, though every instinct told him not to let it go. He watched as she carried the water back toward the kitchen house, her limp more noticeable with each step. Something about the way she clutched her skirt gnawed at him. He knew people who held their pain the same way, hiding it behind silence, hoping no one would see. The evening deepened into night. Stars came out, scattered like silver dust, and the prairie air grew cool. Daniel finished tending the horses and walked the perimeter of the ranch, as he always did, checking fences, making sure no predators had wandered near. His routines were the skeleton of his life, steady, reliable, unshaken. But that night his mind kept circling back to Clara. Inside the house, the faint glow of a lamp shone through the kitchen window. Daniel paused outside, watching through the thin curtain. Clara moved slowly about the room, placing bread on the counter, stirring a pot. Every movement was careful, deliberate, as though she were protecting one side of her body. At one point, she sat down heavily in a chair and pressed her hand to her thigh, wincing as if the act of sitting caused her pain. Daniel frowned. He didn't like mysteries on his land. Later, when the ranch had gone quiet, he sat at his table with a cup of black coffee. The ticking of the clock filled the silence. He thought of the girl's pale face, her forced smile, the limp she couldn't hide. He remembered the stories whispered in town about drifters on the road, about men who had come through looking for work but stayed to make trouble. Willow Creek wasn't a lawless place, but it wasn't safe either. Not with a sheriff who looked the other way when the right men lined his pockets. Daniel had stayed out of town politics, but he knew corruption when he saw it. He'd seen enough of it in his younger years to last a lifetime. The creak of a floorboard pulled him from his thoughts. Daniel rose silently, stepping toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. The lamp was still burning, though it was close to midnight. He pushed open the door gently. Clara was there, hunched over the table, her hands trembling as she tried to mend a tear in her dress with needle and thread. Daniel's eyes dropped to the fabric. It was more than torn. It looked ripped, forcefully across the side. Clara looked up suddenly, startled. "Mr. Harlow," she gasped, standing too quickly. The motion sent a bolt of pain through her leg, and she sank back into the chair, clutching at the edge of the table. Daniel stepped inside, his face unreadable, but his eyes sharp. That dress didn't tear on no kitchen steps. She froze, her breathing shallow. For a long moment silence stretched between them, broken only by the flicker of the lamp flame. Finally her lips parted, but no words came out. Her eyes shimmered, the fear she had tried to bury rising to the surface. Daniel didn't push. He stood there, calm as a still pond, waiting. He knew forcing her to speak would shut her down. Patience, that was his strength. Eventually she whispered, "Please. It's nothing. Don't ask me, sir. Don't." Her voice cracked and tears welled in her eyes. Daniel felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The same one he'd felt years ago when watching good men break under burdens they never deserved. His hands curled into fists at his sides, but his voice remained steady. "You're hurt," he said. "That's something. And I don't allow nothing to walk on this land." Clara looked at him then. Truly looked, as though searching his face for something. Maybe judgment, maybe safety. She bit her lip, shaking her head again. "If you knew, you'd be in danger too." Daniel's eyes darkened, though his expression never shifted. He stepped back, giving her space, his boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. "Danger don't scare me," he said quietly. "But lies do. If you stay here, Clara, you best remember, truth keeps you safe. Lies bury you." He turned, leaving her in the kitchen with the flickering lamp, but the image of her trembling hands and bruised fear burned into his mind. When he stepped out onto the porch, the night air was sharp, carrying the cry of a distant coyote. Daniel's gaze swept across the dark fields of his ranch. He had lived years without interference, years of solitude. But something told him tonight was different. Trouble had crossed his fence, whether Clara admitted it or not, and Daniel Harlow was a man who never turned his back on trouble once it set foot on his land. The night seemed longer than usual. Daniel lay in bed, boots still on, staring at the wooden beams above him. The ranch was silent, but Clara's words kept circling his mind like vultures over carrion. If you knew, you'd be in danger too. Danger was something Daniel had lived with before. It wasn't new to him, but the way Clara's voice had cracked, the way her hands had trembled, told him this wasn't the kind of danger that passed like a storm. This was rooted, thick like weeds that strangled a field. Sleep never came. By the time the horizon flushed gray, Daniel was already out in the yard, feeding the horses, trying to clear his mind. But the image of Clara's bruised arm and torn dress followed him like a ghost. He knew people who hid their pain behind silence. He'd been one of them once. And he also knew that silence never protected anyone for long. When the sun rose higher, Clara appeared again at the kitchen door. She carried a basket of linens, walking slower than before. Her limp hadn't improved overnight. She moved as if every step sent a thread of fire up her leg. Daniel pretended to focus on the horses, but his eyes followed her, studying the stiffness of her movements, the way she avoided looking at him. By midday, the air was heavy with heat. Daniel returned from the far pasture, sweat running down his back. Clara was in the kitchen again, standing at the counter with flour-dusted hands. The smell of bread baking filled the air, warm and comforting, though her expression betrayed no comfort. She glanced up as he entered, her lips parting slightly as if to greet him, but the words caught in her throat. "Sit," Daniel said simply, nodding toward the table. His tone wasn't harsh, but it left no room for refusal. She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself into the chair, her body stiff. Daniel poured himself a glass of water, drank, then leaned against her shoulders hunched, her fingers twisting together in her lap. She stared at the table, not at him. "Who did it?" he asked. His voice was calm, steady. Not demanding, simply certain. Clara shook her head quickly. "Please, Mr. Harlow, I can't." "You can," He interrupted softly, his eyes steady on her. "You're already on my land. That means you're under my care. If there's trouble, I need to know. If you hide it, it'll follow you, and it'll follow here." Her breathing quickened. She lifted her gaze finally, and her eyes shimmered with tears she fought to hold back. "It ain't your fight," she whispered. "You don't know what they'll do. You stand against them, you'll lose everything." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I've lost things before." Still here, her lips quivered. For a long moment she stayed silent, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Then, as though something inside her cracked under the weight, she whispered, "They've been following me." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Who?" "A man," she said, her voice trembling. "Since I came to town. At first he just watched. I thought it was nothing. Then he started saying things, dark things. Said I owed him. Said if I didn't give him what he wanted, he'd make sure I regretted ever stepping foot in Willow Creek." Daniel's hands curled around the edge of the counter, knuckles whitening. What did he want? Clara hesitated, then shook her head, ashamed. "Me," she whispered. "He wanted me." The air thickened between them. Daniel's eyes darkened, but his face remained calm. He had seen enough of the world to know cruelty when it came knocking. He had seen it in the eyes of men who thought they could take whatever they wanted. "When?" he asked, her voice cracked. 2 nights ago. He followed me after I left the mercantile. Said the sheriff wouldn't help me. Said the sheriff's the one who told him I was alone with no kin to protect me." Her hands shook now, clasped tightly together in her lap. "He grabbed me in the alley. I fought him off. I ran. But he tore my dress. That's why—" She stopped, swallowing hard, tears spilling down her cheeks. Daniel's chest tightened. He had suspected something darker than a fall. But hearing it confirmed stoked a quiet fire in his gut. He walked to the table, pulled out the chair opposite her, and sat down slowly. His eyes locked on hers. "You believe the sheriff's in on it?" Clara nodded quickly, fear flashing in her gaze. "I know it. Everyone in town whispers it. Sheriff takes coin to look the other way. That man, he works for him. If I go back to town, they'll find me again." "And if you go against them?" Her voice broke. "They'll kill you." The room grew quiet again. Daniel leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. His face gave nothing away, but inside his thoughts churned like storm clouds. He had stayed clear of town politics, kept his head down, kept his land safe. But Clara's words lit a fuse he had buried years ago. He knew corruption. He knew what it did to towns, to people, to lives. And he knew silence only gave it power. "You should leave," Clara whispered suddenly, as though desperate. "If you send me away, they won't have reason to come here. You can go on living in peace." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "This ranch protects its own. You're here. That means you're under my roof. And as long as you're here, nobody lays a hand on you." Clara's lips parted, stunned by the quiet conviction in his tone. For the first time since arriving, a flicker of relief crossed her face. But it was fragile, like glass on the edge of breaking. "You don't understand," she whispered again. "These men, they don't stop. The sheriff, he's untouchable. He's got the whole town afraid of him." Daniel's jaw flexed. "Sheriffs bleed same as any man." The way he said it made Clara shiver. There was no bluster in his voice, no reckless bravado. Just certainty, cold and steady. She realized then that Daniel wasn't a man to be swayed by fear. He was a man who had lived with it, wrestled it, and come out harder than steel. Her tears spilled freely now, and she lowered her head into her hands. Daniel sat in silence, letting her cry, his own expression carved from stone. He didn't move to comfort her with touch. That wasn't his way. But his presence was steady, grounding like a mountain rooted against a storm. When her sobs quieted, she looked up again, her face streaked. "Why would you risk yourself for me? I'm nobody. Just a maid you hired." Daniel studied her, his eyes unreadable. "You're on my land. That makes you somebody." The words struck her deeper than he realized. For months she had been drifting, invisible, treated as less than human by those who saw her only as an outsider with no kin, no protection. In Daniel's quiet way, he had just declared her worth. The clock ticked. Outside, a crow cawed. Clara wiped her face, but fear still lingered in her eyes. She whispered, "If you go after him, if you try to stand against them, they'll crush you." Daniel rose slowly, his chair scraping against the wood. He walked to the window, looking out over the land bathed in sunlight. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of stone. "Let them try. Clara stared at his back, realizing then that the quiet rancher was not a man who avoided fights out of fear. He avoided them because when he chose to fight, he fought to the bone. And something told her that once Daniel Harlow set his mind on protecting her, nothing in Willow Creek, sheriff or outlaw, would stop him. She had no idea then what storm those words would unleash. Daniel didn't ride into town often. He preferred the wide stretches of his land, the quiet rhythm of ranch work, the kind of silence that told no lies. But the next morning he saddled his mare before the sun had fully risen, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed. Clara had barely slept. He'd heard her footsteps pacing above the kitchen, soft sobs muffled by the walls. She didn't know he was leaving, and he didn't plan to tell her until after it was done. The road into Willow Creek stretched dusty and long, lined with sagebrush and the distant silhouettes of mountains. As Daniel rode, memories pressed in on him, dark ones from years he never spoke of. He remembered towns like Willow Creek, places where lawmen turned criminals and honest folk paid the price. He remembered the taste of blood and dust, the way justice was twisted into a bargain. Those were the days he'd walked away from, promising never to go back. But here he was, drawn back in by a maid with a limp and a bruise she was too afraid to explain until the truth clawed its way out. When Willow Creek came into view, its wooden storefronts glowing in the early light, Daniel pulled his hat lower over his brow. The town looked the same as always, quiet, harmless to an untrained eye. Merchants opened their shops, women swept porches, and children darted through the dusty street. But Daniel saw the other layer. The men who lingered too long at corners watching, the subtle glances exchanged between deputies in the sheriff's colors, the kind of tension that told him Clara had spoken the truth. He tied his mare outside the sheriff's office and stepped inside without knocking. The place smelled of tobacco and stale coffee. A deputy at the desk glanced up, startled, but Daniel's silent stare froze him in place. Behind the desk, Sheriff Amos Pike sat with his boots propped up, hat tipped low, reading a newspaper. "Well, well," Pike drawled, not looking up. "If it ain't the ghost rancher himself, to what do I owe the honor?" Daniel didn't bother with pleasantries. He stepped forward and dropped a thick envelope onto the desk. The sound of it hitting wood was sharp, final. Pike's eyes flicked down at it, then up at Daniel with a slow, mocking smile. "What's this?" "Read it," Daniel said, his voice flat. Pike leaned forward, lifting the envelope. He slid out the papers inside, unfolding them. As his eyes scanned the first page, his smirk wavered. He flipped to the next sheet, then the next, his brow furrowing deeper each time. The deputies in the room shifted uncomfortably, sensing a shift in their leader's confidence. "What's this supposed to be?" Pike asked, though his tone had hardened. "Records," Daniel replied. "Names, dates, deals, everything you've been hiding under this town. Smuggling routes, payoffs, land grabs. The man who's been trailing my maid." His voice didn't rise, didn't need to. It carried the weight of a man who had prepared for this moment, who had waited silently and watched carefully, collecting proof brick by brick. Pike's mouth twitched. He set the papers down slowly, trying to reclaim his swagger. "You think some scribbles on paper mean anything? This is my town, Harlow. Men here know who keeps them safe. They won't turn on me because you came swaggering in with a handful of lies." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "They're not lies. Those papers are copies. Originals went east last week. Marshals will be here soon enough. What you're holding is just a courtesy, your chance to understand that the ground you've built under your boots is crumbling." The deputies froze. A silence stretched in the room, broken only by the faint creak of the sheriff's chair as he leaned back slowly. His eyes narrowed, studying Daniel. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "You've been digging," Pike said, his voice lower now. "For how long?" "Long enough," Daniel replied. The sheriff barked a humorless laugh, though it didn't carry the same weight it usually did. "I knew there was something off about you. Quiet men are the worst kind. They watch, they wait, they think they're smarter than the rest. But you don't know who you're playing with, Harlow. You don't know how deep this runs." Daniel's expression remained carved from stone, deep enough to touch a girl who's done no harm. "That's all I needed to know." Pike's jaw tightened. He slapped the papers back onto the desk. "You think marshals scare me? By the time anyone gets here, I'll have you buried so far in the ground your cattle won't even sniff you out." One of the deputies shifted, hand twitching toward his holster. Daniel's eyes flicked to the movement, then back to Pike. His voice dropped to a quiet growl. "Try it," the The deputy froze, his hand hovering. There was something in Daniel's tone, calm, certain. Like a man who had already killed and would do so again without hesitation, that rooted him to the spot. Pike leaned forward, elbows on the desk, staring at Daniel. "Why risk it?" he asked softly. "You've kept to yourself all these years. Why stick your neck out now?"
"For a maid?"
Daniel's eyes darkened, his voice as steady as ever. "Because she's under my roof, and no man takes what's mine to protect." The sheriff's sneer faltered. His mouth opened as if to retort, but no words came. For the first time in years, Sheriff Amos Pike realized he wasn't the only man in town who carried shadows darker than lawlessness. The standoff broke when Daniel turned and walked out, leaving the papers scattered across the desk. Deputies exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to follow, unsure whether the ground beneath them was shifting faster than they could keep up. Pike sat frozen, the words on those pages burning into his eyes, his mind racing with possibilities, with threats he hadn't anticipated. Outside, Daniel mounted his mare. The morning sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the town. Folks paused to watch him ride by, whispering. Some eyes carried curiosity, others quiet hope, as if they'd seen a crack in the sheriff's armor for the first time. Daniel ignored them all. His focus was already back on the ranch, on Clara, on the storm he had just set into motion. He knew what would come next. Pike wouldn't take this lying down. Men like him never did. There would be retaliation, a test of will, a strike meant to scare him off. Daniel welcomed it. He had lit the fire. Now he was ready for the flames. Back at the ranch, Clara stood on the porch when he rode in. Her face was pale, her hands twisting in her apron. She could read the tension in his body, the set of his jaw. "You went," she whispered. More accusation than question. Daniel dismounted, tying the reins to the post. He looked at her, his eyes steady. "I went," her breath hitched. "Do you know what you've done? He won't stop now. He'll come for you, for both of us." Daniel stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dirt. "He was already coming for you. Only difference is now he knows I'm waiting." Clara's eyes filled with tears, fear and relief warring inside her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to lean on the strength he carried so effortlessly, but she knew the sheriff's power. She'd seen men vanish, families driven out, lives ruined. And yet in Daniel's presence, for the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, she felt a sliver of safety. Daniel's gaze swept the horizon, the ranch stretching wide around them. "This land's seen storms before," he said quietly. "It'll weather this one too." Clara swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "And if it doesn't?" Daniel's eyes met hers, hard as flint but steady as the earth. "Then I'll be the last man standing." She believed him, not because his words were loud, but because they were quiet, spoken with the certainty of a man who had nothing left to fear. That night, as the sun bled into the horizon and the sky burned crimson, Daniel stood on the porch, rifle across his lap. The ranch lay still, but he knew it was the calm before the storm. Somewhere in town, Amos Pike was plotting, gathering men, sharpening his response. And Daniel Harlow was waiting, not with dread, but with the grim patience of a man who had chosen his ground and dared the world to try to take it from him.